Okay, I had to go ahead and do it. I had to do a video on antennas. And really, this is the very touchy third rail of amateur radio, where there are many duals. I have the Hustler Sword of Iniquity with the top hat guard of freedom, and I'm ready to defend myself during these antenna discussions. I'm going to breach the subject of the ham and his antenna from a psychological standpoint before we actually get into the technical, and we are going to have a very efficient DX antenna coming out of this video, so don't get too excited. We first have to go over the 4 different classes of radio amateurs and their antennas. Okay, you might recognize this quad chart, and we've divided the amateurs into 4 different categories, and as we go up we have more and more resources, and by resources I mean not only financial resources but resources in terms of acreage, height, and so on. We go from left to right, from the very inexperienced to the scientist, physicist, and antenna expert. Now, if we were to talk about these people in terms of the type of car that they might own, their sensibilities, in other words. You're going to have some various cars that I'm using to represent the personalities. And I think most people understand what this chart means. So I've got what's called a quad chart here. And the quadrants are 1, 2, 3, 4, if you guys know how to play with these charts. And we have 4 categories of ham radio antenna users, or antenna aficionados. Starting in section 1, we have the professional, or the pro section. And the pros, of course, are interested in location, large arrays, and phased dipoles, and stacked beams, many beams, large multiple towers, switched beverages. You're going to hear all of this. And also, on this pro side, we're leaning toward the expert, okay? The unlimited resources. Let's look at the 4 outer categories. We have unlimited resources up top. We have limited resources down below. We have the novice to the left. And we have the expert to the right, the antenna expert. Everybody knows him. He's using Smith charts, the latest modeling. He's working with ground effects and ground losses. And then we have the novice, who is just trying to use a wire in his attic. So we have the professional quadrant. We're going to work over to quadrant 2, which is the formula ham. What is a formula ham? A formula is, if you do this, you get that. For instance, what car should I own? And the answer is Mercedes. That would be a formula person. It's very simple. If you want to own the best car, buy a Mercedes. No discussion. You simply do this, you get that. So in the formula area, we have, of course, the dipole, the center-fed dipole, as high as you can get it, fed with ladder line and maybe some fancy series tuner. It's going to get results, I'll guarantee it. Tower and beam. What's the trademark of having a ham in the neighborhood? A giant tower with a beam. Hey, honey, that looks like a ham owns that house. Maybe he'd like to sell it. How about the 4-square vertical array? You can buy a whole kit. Simply set it up to the instructions. You will get performance. you'll be able to get nulls and beam maximas to work that DX. Cubicle quad antenna. Tried, true, it works. There's no doubt about it. Working down to quadrant 3, the casual operator. The casual operator has a dipole. It's a coax-fed dipole. It might be a variation on the dipole like a G5RV or a Wyndham or a trap dipole or some other type of fan dipole. He might have a trap vertical. A trap vertical is a signature of the casual operator. You throw the thing in the backyard with a couple radials, you are on the air. The horizontal loop. Everybody loves the horizontal loop. You put a horizontal loop around your property, bang, you're on the air. Casual operator, classic. And then we finally go over to quadrant 4, the experimenter. The experimenter is never satisfied. He wants to try to achieve the performance that you get in the upper section, but he's going to do it the hard way. So that means he's going to be using fancy wire arrays like lazy H's and 8JK arrays. He's going to be playing with perhaps a hex beam or some fancy wire beam. He's going to have he's a mobile operator, by the way, and he knows how to make his mobile antenna as efficient as possible for the car. He's going to be playing with radial systems. He's going to take a quadrant 3 antenna, a simple vertical, and turn it into the most effective DX antenna on the planet through messing with radials and phasing verticals and so on. Okay, so if you're not upset by now or offended by anything I've said, then maybe I'm not being effective. But I just wanted to show you that as we go through our ham career, okay, and by career I mean as you go from a novice all the way up to extra, or you become like your Elmer and become well-versed in ham radio and finally gain the means to have a station. You've gained enough wealth to maybe move to an area that will give you better performance. You can finally put up a tower or two. You've arrived. You're generally working this direction on the chart. You're heading up towards the first quadrant. Okay, now that I've done these unfair generalizations of the different types of ham radio antenna personalities or personas, let's talk about a real antenna. You know, as you go lower in frequency, the antennas become a little bit harder. That's because stacking elements to get gain and lowering your angle with height, lowering your angle of radiation with height becomes much more difficult. When you're up at the 10 meter band, you get an antenna up 30 feet. And wavelengths, that's quite high. But down at 80 meters, only having a dipole at 30 feet, well, the signal's going to essentially go straight up and straight down. So it's much more difficult to gain DX type of performance with the low frequency. The quickest way to cheat the system, in effect, and get a low angle radiation is to use, as the antenna commander says, a vertical antenna. A vertical antenna, by its nature, gives you the best chance for a low angle of radiation, and it's all done through physics. It's natural. So as you improve your radial field, your signal continues to lower, and you're going to get the DX. So that's a very simple way to maximize your DX performance, is to use a vertical antenna. So you may be asking, how are these guys doing DX with horizontal dipoles, phase dipoles, large vertical loops, delta loops, and so on? It's very simple. They're either feeding the antenna to give you a vertical polarization, or they're using a lot of height. And most of them are going for the height option. the higher you can get the horizontal antenna, the lower the angle of radiation. So they're simply going for height with horizontal antennas and many times phasing antennas together to get the DX performance. However, verticals have been very popular for people who have enough room to put out a vertical array. And by a vertical array, I mean verticals that are spaced at quarter, half wavelength, and so on with phasing lines. So I'm going to describe an antenna that I had room to put on my property. It's basically a vertical array made of a driven element and two parasitic elements. A very simple vertical array, and that's the antenna we'll go over in this video. I wanted to show you guys a simple antenna project. This is an 80-meter ground plane antenna, a ground plane antenna. Full size. Basically, these are all 65-foot pieces of number 12 copper wire. And it's going to be elevated radials. And for coax, I've buried some LMR 240 coax. And this is the DB style, the direct burial style, so it's just buried across the yard. This stuff may look small, but believe me, it can handle some serious power. And it's a fairly low loss cable. What would be better? LMR 400, of course, would be even less loss. Of course, on 80 meters, we don't have that much loss in coax anyway. But anyway, I wanted to let you know I'm using just a very simple coax. I'd like to get the radials over my head, so maybe at the 10, 12 foot level, step ladder level, I would call that. And we're using this tree, and we will haul up the center element, the vertical, into the top of this tree. Let's take a look at it. Okay, that's a nice tall tree to haul an antenna up. I think we can get the full 66, 65, 62, however many feet it takes to resonate it, pulled up there, and still get it well over our head. Okay, so I've got the ground plane kind of wired up, and 4 radials and 1 element going straight up the tree. Okay. Now this antenna, I made it purposely a little bit long. The radials are about 66 feet long, and the driven element is long as well. So I did sweep it, and the kind of results I got basically show that it is indeed low in frequency, but we have made a beautiful CW ground plane for DX. Look at that thing. It's beautifully tuned between 3.5 and 3.6 megahertz in the 80 meter band. So I haven't touched a thing. As you can see, it's just kind of twisted together, and right out of the box, a good SWR. Isn't that exciting? Oh wait, hold it. Why am I getting such a good SWR? If this antenna was truly tuned properly, and I had enough radials and a good enough ground, I would expect the SWR not to be 1-to-1. I would expect it to be up around 1.5-to-1 or something like that, or 1.3-to-1. So obviously we still have a lot of ground losses. So we have been fooled into thinking we've got a good antenna here, when actually we've got quite a bit of ground loss, and we've got some resistance being added by the ground, and that's making the match better. So I know it's a bit discouraging when we try to build an antenna and then you have a lot of comments coming in from all directions on how the antenna should work or should not work. Does it need to be modeled? And are the parameters in your model anywhere near the reality of the environment? I mean, look at my woods. We have these big pine trees. Are they conductors or are they insulators? Do they act to increase gain or decrease gain? How do they affect the Q of the antenna? What's my soil conductivity? And by raising the radials 3 or 4 meters above ground, what effect does that have on the ground plane that we're trying to artificially create to improve the antenna's performance? How can we isolate that slightly raised ground plane from the ground so that we have less ground losses, so we can lessen the ground losses and improve performance? Very hard to model in the real world. So there's a lot of hand waving going on. The patterns aren't going to be these beautiful figure eights that you see with a vertical dipole that's in free space. There's going to be all kinds of ground influences, some of them helpful, by the way. We may find that instead of having a gain of 2 or 3 dB as predicted, that we might end up with 4 or 5 dB simply because the ground reflections are reinforcing the beam at a certain angle. Now, with luck, that angle is low enough that it improves our chances for DX. Okay, we've got our ground plane. We've got this little alligator clip, because I know I'm going to have to shorten it up. I'd like to bring this antenna up into the phone band around 3.75, the DX window, the single sideband window, 3.7 to 3.8 megahertz. So that means we're going to have to take off a little bit of length, which I'm counting on, because I'd like to get this thing up a little further. Okay, here we are, the finished product. We've got 5 radials. They're coming out pretty equal angles. And I've got 3 ferrite beads. One just clicked on, and I've got 2 with a loop through. Why are we doing this? We want to decouple the coax, which is grounded. As a matter of fact, the coax is buried. We do not want that to become part of our radial system because that's part of the ground losses. So we want to isolate ourselves from ground and allow the radials to become the artificial ground plane. I like to use these beads and just loop through them. And there's nothing wrong with using multiple beads. The more beads you use, the more isolation you get. So to test the antenna, I have a little setup that I kind of put together quickly. I have the small Swan 100 MX, and I'm going into the tuner which is feeding a linear amplifier, which I've recently refurbished. It's a real classic. It's a Gonset GSB 201 from about 1961-62. So Mike, do you expect that this thing is going to work? This is actually one of my least favorite things to do, and that's trying to model these antennas. You know, I'm not a great believer in models, but they do get you in the right direction at least. Here's a model you should look at. Actually, an antenna model is not the end-all. If we consider the old ground-mounted vertical with 32 radials, you can see that we've got a couple dB of gain, and it has a fairly low angle. It's only down a few dB at that 5-degree angle we want for DX. So that's all I'm going to say about the ground-mounted vertical with lots of radials. Tried, true, an excellent DX antenna. And if you've got room for more radials, load it up, because more is better, and you're going to have a lot of fun with that antenna. But we have to do something a little different here. We're going to bring this up. We're only going to give it 4 or 5 radials, about 3 meters in the air. And in the model already we're seeing that our gain has gone down a couple dB. We're not as good as the ground mounted because the radials are not performing as well apparently. We still have some pretty good low angle radiation, but again the model says that we're down, and we're down 5 dB. Let's compare it to an excellent dipole, one that's up a half wave for the best low angle. That dipole should be whipping us easily. He's got a really nice low bunny ears, and he's sending some juice out. My poor inverted V, however, is sending energy mostly to the locals, and it's a pretty high angle radiator. So I just like to sanity check an 80 meter antenna at 3.3 on CHU, which is located in Canada, north of us. So this is my dipole. It's a good signal. And we're going to go over to the ground plane. Okay, here's the ground plane. Ground plane, dipole. Ground plane, dipole. Ground plane, dipole. About 10 dB into Canada. Then the dipole. Now let's go up to a local station, a station that is in New England, and we'll see how this works. Local AM station on the dipole. Ground plane. Dipole. Ground plane. Dipole. Ground plane. So definitely the dipole. So when you have local conditions, this is late Sunday morning, local AM activity on the dipole. So this is almost 100% near vertical incidence type communication, straight up and straight down on the ionosphere. So we're going to go from the dipole to the vertical. Very little energy coming in on the vertical, which tells you that it's not ground wave. This is near vertical incidence signal. And back on the dipole. So England is really coming in on that vertical. They're saying it's 10 dB hotter than the dipole. It's funny because on receive it's not that drastic. Let me switch to the dipole. So that's the dipole. Okay, back to the vertical. They do come up, but it's more drastic on their end. The vertical, of course, very much outperforming the dipole across the pond. A full-size vertical, whether ground-mounted or elevated, is going to give you some beautiful performance for DX. It's going to be a low-angle radiator. But we would like to add a parasitic director and see if we can get a little bit of gain in the desired direction, which for me is towards Europe. How are we going to adjust that parasitic element for maximum gain? And the first thing that you think of course, is field strength. You measure the field strength and try to maximize it by tuning the element. And the loop antenna and an inline loop antenna, vertically polarized, is the generally accepted method. But you need to be out at least 2 or 3 wavelengths into the far field to get an accurate measurement. A whip antenna is also effective. You're going to pick up a little more noise and maybe local interference, but you can see how far out you have to be to get accurate measurements with field strength. It might not be practical for your setup. I know for me, this was a tough thing to pull off, and I didn't think I could do it with this method, on 80 meters at least. Now, you might have heard of reciprocity, meaning that RF goes both ways equally, so why not put a little beacon transmitter out there someplace unattended at a very low power, and now you put the receiver at the antenna, and you tune it backwards. So this is a reverse method of tuning the elements. We're going to insert a cap or an inductor at the element and see if it's too long or too short, and then cut the element accordingly. But the method that I ended up using, and this is probably due to sheer laziness, is I simply use the old handbook formula of cutting the director 5% shorter than the driven element. And if we're going to use a reflector, you cut it 5% longer than the driven element. So we've got our antenna working. It's got 5 radials. Made a good contact. Have used it on sideband and CW on 80 meters. Seems to work well. And the next step is I'd like to put a Parasitic Director on the front of it. So if we go through our formulas, we remember the old half-wave formula. You know, with the half-wave formula, it's 468 divided by the frequency, and then quarter wave is half of that. So you guys are all familiar with that. If you go to the radio amateur handbook, the antenna handbook. Now in the antenna handbook, they do have a formula for determining the reflector and the director in a beam, but of course these are vertical antennas, so they're much closer to the original half-wave dipole, quarter-wave numbers. So the numbers are actually a little bit larger than if you use those numbers that are in the handbook. So for instance, here's the driven, the director, and the reflector. And we can work those backwards once we calculate the lengths, and we can determine some target frequencies for the director and for the reflector. And this is done by plugging the shorter and the longer numbers back into the original driven element number, and that gives you the resonant frequency of each of those. So the next step is to try to determine the resonance of that parasitic element. We want to know what frequency it's actually electrically tuned to. Forget the calculations, forget the models. We want to know actually what is the frequency of this director. Extremely windy day today. So, of course, the ideal instrument to use would be an antenna analyzer or a bridge. But we can use a small transceiver to determine resonance with an VSWR bridge. Now it's important to know that we're not interfering, and we want to use as low power as we possibly can. So it's always good to monitor frequency. Now this is the middle of the day on 80 meters, and you can pretty much tune around the band this time of day and you're not going to hear anything. It's just noise. This is a good time to do the test, except for this wind. Okay, so I have the driven element loaded with 50 ohm load right at the end of the coax where the transmitter would be. And I am showing completely flat SWR at 3900. And that's very close to where we want our director. So the next question is the driven element influencing this frequency? We really should decouple the driven element if we want to know exactly what the resonance is. Okay, we now have the director swinging in the breeze, completely decoupled, somewhat decoupled, from the ground plane at least. And I found the resonance might have gone up 25 kilohertz. Not drastically. So I'm going to declare that you can probably tune these elements, the director and the reflector, with the driven element just simply hooked up to a 50 ohm load on the end of the coax, and we'll call that good enough. Okay, a quick look at the pattern. Looks like we've got some pretty good gain here. It's over 5, and at low angle we've got a little more juice. Shows signs of promise. I didn't try to optimize anything, but we have, 7 or 8 dB of front to back. This is about what I'd expect without optimizing anything.
In the evening of this type of propagation, 40 is also very good indeed.
Well, I can tell you the antenna is working. I just got a 5.9 plus 40 dB over 9 in England. 811s of any brand, I guess. I didn't really look in there to see what somebody had stuck in there, but I can tell you they are the original 811 tubes that came with the amplifier. And I've done quite a bit to the amp to settle it down. I put a step start in it, which basically allows the tubes to light up a little bit and the high voltage to come up slower. And I also improved the bias circuit on the linear pretty drastically. It was quite primitive. They took the 6.3 volts for the tubes and grounded one side and developed the bias with a diode. Now tonight the band is in very poor condition, and I just worked a station in Spain, and he remarked that this was the only American station that he's heard all night. So looking quickly at the 3-element, it's really a close-spaced beam because I've got the director at about 0.1 lambda and the reflector is at about 0.15. And, it's a lot of wire. But I limited the number of radials, and the antenna certainly is putting a beam toward Europe, there's no doubt about it. It's going to look something like this. If you fool with the director, you can get some crazy front-to-back type action on the thing. It won't affect the gain much, but the front-to-back ratio can be improved drastically by fooling around with that director, that close-space director. Whiskey United 2 Delta, WU2D. Yes, good evening. This is WU2D in New Hampshire. I've got a good copy on all 3 stations. The station in Quebec, of course, is blasting in 40 over 9. And YT1AA in Serbia is 10 dB over 9 here in New Hampshire. My name is Mike, Mexico, India, Kilo, Echo, and the QTH is New Hampshire from Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta. Very good signal, Vema. Nice signal here in New Hampshire. And the band seems to be improving this evening. Yankee Tango 1 Alpha Alpha, beautiful 5-9 signal.
Okay, thanks, 5-9, and thank you to my tool. Whiskey United 2 Delta, Hotel Baker Mike Tango Whiskey Kilowatt, 76 from Switzerland. Thank you, bye-bye.
So wielding the sword of truth. Actually, it's the bug splatter of truth, because that means you've actually used this mobile antenna. And the saber of antenna righteousness. We declare victory, DX on 75 meters with simple wires. So do you want to, for instance, have DX capability in the 160 meter band, or maybe the 75 meter DX window, or 40 meters? It's going to be a little more difficult, but we can get a low angle radiator for DX performance in those bands. And the way I chose to do it was with vertical antennas. So I'm agreeing with the DX Commander. I think the vertical is the quickest way to get there.